If you're curious about the medicinal uses and culinary uses of bee balm or Monarda or wild bergamot, I'll be sharing those in this video. Hi, my name is Landon Gilfillan with Pepper and Pine Garden Design, and I've been doing a series of medicinal herbs and their uses in your kitchen or in your medicinal herb cabinet. And today I'm going to be focusing on the lovely bee balm. Now, bee balm has multiple names that it goes by. The Latin name is Monarda fistulosa, and I have known it as Monarda for a long time, or most commonly known as bee balm. The other name you might hear it referred to as is wild bergamot, which is what we have here, and I'll explain why in a moment. This is different than the bergamot that you've maybe heard with essential oils that has more of a orange citrusy scent to it or taste to it. This is slightly different. This is, well, it is different. It's wild bergamot, otherwise known as bee balm and Monarda. So how do you identify this beautiful plant? Well, this one actually I found growing on my property. I didn't even know it was here until last week when we were taking a walk around our trail, and I saw this very distinct head, this very distinct flower popping up out of my corner of my eye, and I knew exactly what it was. I will zoom in here in a second, but it has this sort of Medusa look to it with these little plumes of either purple, pink, sometimes red flowers, and it grows on a stem with, these are a lot smaller leaves here at the top, but the leaves can get up to about 4 inches long. This is what a bee balm or Monarda leaf looks like. Leaves are fairly spaced out. They're a lot more slender than bee balm's cousin, anise hyssop. Bee balm is in the mint family with anise hyssop, obviously your mints, lemon balm, nepeta, if you've heard of nepeta. This flower is so beautiful. As its name implies, it is very attractive to the bees and the butterflies. In fact, I scared off a few bees right before I sat down into this video. And yesterday there was a huge, beautiful butterfly drinking nectar from this flower. It's such a lovely plant to have in the garden, whether as an ornamental or as a medicinal herb. So let's kind of get into how you can use bee balm. Let's talk about the culinary applications of bee balm. Obviously, we have another edible flower, which would be lovely topping a salad. I always think of nasturtiums and pansies as the flowers I like to put on salads, but you can also use the flowers of anise hyssop or the flowers of bee balm to decorate your salads. You can also use the leaves to put in salads. As I mentioned a minute ago, this particular herb has a similar taste to oregano and thyme. So any way that you would use oregano thyme, you can use the leaves of bee balm. The flowers, again, can enhance salads, dessert, and of course, tea. It does have a natural sweetness to it, which people have used to make jelly. So I have not done this, but I would imagine that you would use the leaves or flowers of bee balm as sort of a spice to a jelly that you are making. So you would want to have a separate base, maybe with berries or even green tomatoes. You can use green tomatoes to make jelly as long as you have something to flavor it with. So bee balm might be a really great addition to a jelly because of its natural sweetness and then of course its medicinal properties. You can also use the leaves and flowers of bee balm to make vinegars. If you've heard of using herbs to have herbed vinegar, there's another way you can use bee balm. And also in a mead, which is a sort of fermented drink, M-E-A-D. I've never made mead, but I am getting curious about making it, and bee balm is one of the herbs that you can use to make mead. So that might be something to look up if you are interested in those types of drinks. Now let's get into the medicinal uses of bee balm and some of that terminology I was mentioning. So what I would like to do is kind of break down the different ways that bee balm is helpful using some of the probably medicinal herb terminology that you've heard and explaining exactly what that means. The essential oil that is predominant in bee balm is Monarda punctata. I need to work on my Latin. But that essential oil is also known more commonly as horse mint and it helps to prevent infections. So clearly, this is an antiseptic, antiviral, antibacterial herb that helps to fight off disease-causing microorganisms. And that's the first word that we can look at is antiseptic. Bee balm has a very strong antiseptic quality that helps to kill off disease-causing organisms. And as I'll list here in a minute, you can see all the different ways that you can use this herb for those specific properties. Two other compounds that are fairly prominent in bee balm are geraniol, as well as the antiseptic thymol. So if you're familiar with essential oils, thymol is the oil that you find in the herb thyme. So thymol is also present in bee balm. And actually, when you're using this herb culinarily, it does have the similar flavor to oregano and thyme, and that is because of that thymol oil. So those two oils, if you know, thyme is a really strong antiseptic herb that helps to prevent against infection. So one of the ways that this can be used is as a mouthwash that you can swish around to ward off tooth decay or any sort of infections in your mouth. It's also known for treating halitosis, which I think is interesting. The sort of chronic bad breath that some people experience, bee balm is known to help fight off that infection that's happening deeper in your throat that causes that chronic bad breath, halitosis. Another essential oil in Monarda is Monarda didyma, and actually this particular oil has an antiplatelet property. So what is antiplatelet? Well, platelet obviously is talking about the platelets in your blood, and so what happens is this herb can have or is shown to have an effect on anti-agglutination or aggregation, which means the sticking of blood cells together, which can cause blood clots. So that is something to note. If you are avoiding blood thinners, this can have a blood thinning property about it because it helps those cells to not stick together and cause blood clots. So that may be a good thing or it may be a bad thing depending on what you're dealing with, but do be aware it may have those properties. So some of the terms that are known with bee balm are antispasmodic, antimicrobial, antiseptic, NERVINE, and as I mentioned earlier, antiplatelet. So what do those mean? Well, obviously antimicrobial means that it is fighting against any microbes that might be disease causing, which again kind of goes along with antiseptic. So it has disease fighting properties, or more specifically, fighting against any sort of disease causing microorganism. That is where you have the antimicrobial property. How would you use that? Well, you would use that as a tea or a tincture that you would take internally to fight off any sort of cold or flu or something along those lines, right? Very similar to a lot of the other herbs that we've talked about in these videos that you can drink as a tea whenever a cold or a flu comes along. You can also apply it topically, whether you're doing a poultice, a salve, or even an oil to address any sort of cut or scrape you might have on your skin, some sort of irritation, and have that antimicrobial effect on your skin externally. In fact, it's been known to be used to help with scrapes, stings, rashes, minor wounds. I would not say this is something you would use for a deep wound, but a minor wound on your skin, you can use bee balm poultices, salves, and oils for those purposes. It's also a great herb to use for digestive ailments for two reasons. Number one, it is antispasmodic, which means anti-spasm. So it helps reduce spasms if you're having spasmodic issues in your digestive tract. That also for menstrual cramps, there's a spasm that happens there, so that can help to calm that down. It is also a nervine. So any plant in the mint family, which bee balm is, so again, lemon balm, mint, nepeta, and hyssop, they all have nervine properties, which means that they are soothing to the nervous system. So if you're looking for something to help treat indigestion, bloating, gas, anything that has a little bit of an anti-inflammatory, a physically anti-inflammatory symptom, then bee balm, as well as the other herbs in the mint family can help to soothe and calm those particular symptoms and issues down. So again, digestive issues is another way that you can use bee balm. And that would generally be taken internally, whether as a tea or as a tincture. Also, along with antispasmodic properties, bee balm can be used as something to help with a spasmodic cough. So if you're struggling with that cough, that consistent cough that sometimes you get hung up with, I know I experienced that for a while a few years ago where I just could not stop coughing, that antispasmodic properties of bee balm can help to calm that cough down, allowing you to breathe and feel somewhat normal again. Along with the antimicrobial and antiseptic properties, this is an all-around great herb to have whenever you have that cough and cold and flu symptoms. Additionally, with the NERVINE, as again with mint and lemon balm and even chamomile, soothing not only your physical body but your nerves and your mental capacity. It can be soothing for anxiety and depression, and just if you're feeling frazzled for the day, bee balm, along with its wonderful citrus and sweet taste, can be great for just a soothing tea to have at the end of the day or the middle of the day if you're just wanting to bring it down a bit and just calm down. This is another great herb to drink for a tea. So how do you use this herb? Well, I've mentioned a couple ways, right? Tea. Almost every herb that I've talked about in these videos can be used as a tea. And this particular herb, you can use both the leaves and the flowers. Now, similar to anise hyssop, the leaves are going to have a more potent flavor than the flowers will, but both can be used. So if you want to just cut off the whole plant and have the flower intact, you can do that. I like to leave the flower intact to attract the pollinators. Obviously, the plant behind me is a much smaller plant. I won't be able to harvest as much from it as a more established plant or if there were multiple plants. So in this case, I'm going to leave the flowers and only collect the leaves, which is just fine. I have more bee balm growing in my medicinal herb garden down by the house. It just has not flowered yet. So I wanted to bring you up here to this beautiful specimen so you could actually see the flowers. So if you do make a tea, you're going to use 1 tablespoon of dried leaves and flowers or 2 tablespoons of fresh leaves and flowers and add it to an almost boiling hot water. If it's boiling, it's going to kill off some of those antimicrobial properties because the flowers in particular are super delicate. So you don't want to have really, really hot boiling water. You want to go right before it starts to boil and then let it steep for 15 minutes. Now, I've mentioned this in other videos, but if you're using this as a medicinal tea, then you want to make sure you're drinking it frequently throughout the day in order to get those medicinal properties. You also want to make sure the tea is potent enough. So generally speaking, I use 2 times as much as what you would normally see on like a tea bag. I'll usually double that. So in that case, that's why 1 tablespoon of dry leaves, where you might normally see only 1 teaspoon. And that's to really get that potent medicinal effect. And then I will drink this tea if I'm using it for specific properties every 2 to 3 hours throughout the day. Now you can swap out other teas that have similar properties if you're getting tired of one flavor. That's what's great about having a variety of herbs in your garden. Even though they might have similar medicinal properties, they might have different tastes. So I can go back and forth from peppermint to lemon balm to bee balm if I'm looking for that NERVINE property, because they all have it, but they have different flavors. So that's one reason that you can have various herbs in your garden, is to reap the different flavors that each one presents. But as you're seeing in these videos, a lot of these herbs actually have duplicate properties, so you don't necessarily have to have a very robust medicinal herb garden if you're just wanting those medicinal properties, but it is fun to play with the different flavors. So let's move on to another use in the medicinal herbal cabinet, and that's oxymels. So oxymels are basically a syrup. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your herbs and you're going to mix them with vinegar sometimes. Sometimes you can actually take like a glycerite, if you've made a glycerite tincture, and you can mix that with honey and make a syrup. So that oxymel can be used in place of like a typical syrup that you would buy for a cough or a cold or something along those lines, and use it in that way. So it's basically a homemade syrup. And so since bee balm is a natural decongestant, and like I said, antispasmodic, you can mix the dried leaves with vinegar and honey and recreate a syrup. Now, typically you want to combine those things together over a low heat until they've combined and created that nice syrup, but you don't want to cook it for too long because then that heat will destroy the antimicrobial and antiseptic properties that you're trying to get from that syrup. So basically just put it in a small pan on very low heat until it's well combined, and then store it in a glass jar in a dark place to keep the medicinal properties potent. I've mentioned that you can use this topically as a poultice or a salve. So a poultice is basically taking the leaves, generally fresh leaves, although you can use dried leaves, and you're mashing them up, adding a little bit of water at a time to create a paste. That paste will then be applied directly to the skin, so it'll have a wet, cooling property, which is great for burns and inflammation and itches and bites. Like, that's what I think of are really helpful for poultices. When you have that sort of burning hot sensation on your skin, that poultice will help to not only cool it down, but then obviously have the anti-inflammatory or antimicrobial effects that you're looking for. If you choose to use a salve, what you're doing is you're taking an infused oil that you've already created with the plant. So you would take the dried leaves of bee balm, you would put them in an oil, generally like a sweet almond oil or a olive oil. They would infuse over about a month's time. Then you would strain out the leaves, and then you take that oil and you would melt it down with beeswax generally. Some people add shea butter or coconut oil, however you want to do it. And you create that butter that then can be stored and applied on the skin. So why would you choose poultice over salve or vice versa, where a poultice is very short-lived unless you're freezing it, making a poultice and then freezing it in little ice cube trays in your freezer to be able to pull out and use later on. A poultice is only going to last for so long before you have to discard it. Making a salve or an oil, you can actually store, especially if you add a little bit of vitamin E in there to help it last longer. You can store that and use that multiple times. So that's one thing to consider when you're trying to determine whether to use a poultice or a salve. It's really great to have both on hand. Tinctures are another really great and easy way to get herbs in your body. The nice thing about tinctures is it's basically taking those dried herbs, adding a neutral alcohol like 80 to 95 proof vodka or Everclear, and then allowing it to sit in your pantry for 4 to 6 weeks. So basically you get those herbs, you dry them, you put them in a jar. Now your amounts are going to vary depending on your size of the jar. I think typically it's like a half cup to a cup of herbs to a quart jar that you would then pour the alcohol over. And then every day you need to shake it to make sure that the herbs are definitely getting infused and worked through that alcohol. And then in 4 to 6 weeks, you'll strain it out through a cheesecloth or a coffee filter, and then you'll have your tincture. So it's super easy to put together. And then whenever you use them, you just take a dropper full. It's, you're going to want to look up what your dosing is for different ages. And I hope to include this in a blog post that I'll be working on here in the next few weeks, because dosing will be different for infants, for toddlers, and for adults. But you'll take that very small dosing, which is generally like 1/4 of a teaspoon to a teaspoon, and either take it straight, or you can add it to water or to juice or to something sweet, especially if you're giving it to a child. You can also create what's called a glycerite, which is basically the exact same process, except you're using 100% vegetable glycerin. So glycerin is going to have a much more neutral taste than a vodka or an alcohol will. So most children are more prone to take a glycerite than they will a tincture. The only downside to a glycerite is it doesn't last as long in your pantry. It will only last about a year, whereas a tincture can have a shelf life of up to 5 years. Some people have actually done half and half, where they'll do half alcohol and half glycerin to kind of dial down the alcohol taste, but prolong the shelf life to at least 2 or 3 years. So that's something to consider too. It just kind of depends on your taste preferences and who is actually going to receive that particular dosing. And I should mention, when I'm saying alcohol, you always want to use a consumable alcohol, not a rubbing or isopropyl alcohol. You do not want to use those. Those are not edible for consumption. only alcohols such as vodka, rum, Everclear, and things along those lines. Last but certainly not least, two other ways that you can use this herb is as a wash, like a mouthwash, where you will take the dried leaves and you can either chew them. In fact, I think that's what they used to do in the old days, that they take the leaves and they would chew them in their mouths to get that medicinal property, those antimicrobial, antiseptic properties in their mouth for either wounds or tooth decay or halitosis or whatever you're using it for. Another way you could do it is to actually take that tincture that you've made, add it to water and swish it around in your mouth. Which to me seems like the better way to go, just to make sure that all areas of your mouth are being addressed. So again, take your tincture, mix it with water and swish it around daily or however much you're needing, or take the actual leaves, make sure they're clean, and then chew them in your mouth. So whatever you prefer. I have children that love chewing on herbal leaves, so I have a feeling that would be the way that they would want to take it. And then last but not least, using the dried leaves or the fresh leaves in a bath. So you draw a nice hot bath. You can add the leaves directly to that, or you can make a tea first, a really potent tea, and then take that strained tea and pour it into the bath for the same, all the properties that we've mentioned here: antispasmodic, antiseptic, NERVINE properties, so soothing bath at the end of the night. There's so many ways you can use this herb, and so many of the herbs that I've covered, they have such a wide range of properties. You would be amazed how many things that you can address with just a couple herbs in your garden. Last but not least, let's talk about how to harvest this herb. Now, I've mentioned in some of my other videos that it's ideal to harvest your herbs in the morning, after the dew has evaporated off of them, but before the sun is really directly shining on them. That's when your essential oils, or the oils and the medicinal properties in these herbs, are most potent. So I'm right there at the cusp. The sun has just come up over this tree, and I just wanted to make sure I had a good light to come out here and show you this. So I'm a smidge past probably the ideal time to harvest that, but that's okay. I'm still gonna get some great things from this plant. Now, because this is a smaller plant, I'm not gonna harvest a lot off of it. You wanna make sure you're harvesting no more than 30% or a third of your plant, because it'll cause it too much stress and it might not recover. So in this case, I'm gonna harvest one flower because I think it's beautiful and I wanna show it to my kids, but I'm gonna keep the rest of the flowers intact to draw the pollinators in. And then I'm just going to start at the bottom, snipping off the leaves that look the most healthy, which this looks like a pretty healthy plant. And here's one of the leaves right there. So here is one little stem that I'll harvest. It's a newer stem, and you can tell that because it's green and it's very soft. This would have grown to become one of these woodier stems. And so generally I might want to leave those so it continue to grow out, but I just wanted to show you this. This is actually a great little stem to use for tea. You want to avoid harvesting leaves that look like this. This leaf has some sort of spot on it. It could be a blight. It's yellowing, which means it's already in the dying process, which means that the medicinal properties of this leaf are not going to be as potent as the greener, healthier leaves. So I'm not going to use this. In fact, most of these leaves that look like they're dying or disease, I'm going to cut off and get rid of. And like I've shown you in other videos, you can also cut the stem right at the leaf node, which is going to encourage growth and encourage bushiness on this plant instead of just a really tall vertical plant. Now, I just discovered this the other day, so I haven't been able to prune this plant like I normally would, but I'll show you here what I mean by cutting it at the leaf node to encourage bushiness. So right here, you see this like typical V with a center stem, and this right here is called the leaf node because leaves will grow out of this spot. So I could harvest the plant right here, and this would continue to grow more new stems like this. There's another one of those young stems. I'm hesitant to do that because that would take off 3 of my flowers. So again, if I had more of this plant, had I caught it earlier, I would have done more pruning before these flowers really came in to make sure that it was becoming bushier instead of vertical. But I am going to leave that intact because I really don't want to take all these flowers off. However, right here might be a good spot to take one of the flowers because I've got these leaves growing out here, which will eventually become stems. So I will clip it right there and hopefully encourage more growth. And another thing about bee balm is you do want to deadhead, which will encourage more flowers. So if you start to notice the flowers starting to die or become brown, you can deadhead them, and that will encourage more flowers to grow. So that is basically it, y'all, for harvesting bee balm. Once you've cut your flowers and your leaves, you can take them inside and use them fresh, or you can dry them in various ways that you can use them as the season wears on, or when you no longer have fresh flowers in your garden. So I typically like to dry as much as I can, so I have those things available to me when the season is no longer lush and green like this, or we're in the dead of winter. Or I dry them and make them into the tinctures and the oils that I can use in the winter seasons that are to come. My favorite way of drying things currently is either hanging them by the stems, if I have cut the stems, in a room that's darker and has less traffic, because airflow and light are enemies to herbs. They're going to take away the really potent properties that they have. So you don't want to have them in a space that has a lot of light or a lot of traffic. So I have them in a room off my kitchen that's fairly dark and there's not a lot of people in there. The other way that I found that I really like to dry them is on a cookie sheet in my oven with the light on. It provides just enough heat to speed up the drying process, and then they're away from traffic and airflow, and I have just found that is a really great way to dry herbs. So if this video has been helpful for you, consider subscribing or sharing it with someone you think it might be helpful for. And as always, my name is Landon Gilfillan here at Pepper and Pine Garden Design, growing gardeners in their gardens, and we'll see you in the next video.